I am logging this entry under restricted review, not because of what the recordings contain, but because of how they persist. The device was recovered 18 years after the collapse of Sublevel 4 of the Morrow Ridge Research Annex. By the time the recovery team reached the chamber, the surrounding structure had compacted into a single mass of concrete, rebar, and soil. Most equipment was flattened beyond recognition. Organic remains were present, but incomplete. Identification was inconclusive. The recorder was found inside a corroded equipment locker that had been sheared nearly in half by the collapse. The door no longer sealed. Moisture exposure was severe. Internal corrosion suggested long-term contact with groundwater. By every standard we use, the device should have been inert, unreadable, and unsalvageable. It was none of those things. The model is a handheld digital field recorder, commercially available before the closure era. It does not contain an internal battery. It does not accept removable power cells. Its design requires a direct external power source to operate. That source was not present at the time of recovery, nor could it have been present during the final hours of the facility's operation. When I first examined the metadata, I assumed corruption. That assumption lasted exactly 11 seconds. The total recorded runtime exceeds 800 hours. Not accumulated runtime, continuous runtime. There are no gaps consistent with power interruption, no reboot markers, no corrupted file headers. The timestamps do not reset. They proceed forward without pause, across days, weeks, and eventually years. According to the facility's own logs, total power failure occurred at 0214 local time on the 7th day of the final shutdown sequence. Emergency systems failed shortly afterward. No generator activity is recorded beyond that point. No backup circuits remained functional. The recorder should have stopped at that moment. Instead, it continued. I want to be clear about something before this file proceeds further. Vault 13 has cataloged anomalous recordings before. We have recovered tapes that contain sounds not present at the time of recording. We have analyzed transmissions that outlasted their transmitters. We have even archived material that appears to have been recorded without human involvement. This is not that. This recorder behaves as though power is irrelevant to its operation. Not absent, not replaced, simply unnecessary. Playback does not produce the expected hiss of dead air or digital noise. It produces environment. Footsteps, breathing, fabric shifting, low-frequency vibrations consistent with distant structural movement. All of it rendered with clarity that degrades only when no one is present near the device. That detail took time to notice. I did not discover it during my initial review. I discovered it later after extended listening, when the audio began to change depending on where I was positioned in the archive room. For now, I will confine myself to what can be demonstrated and verified. The earliest recordings are routine. Equipment tests, spoken notes, mundane observations. The voice is calm, professional, and methodical. The speaker is aware of the recorder as a tool, nothing more. The later recordings are not routine. They do not escalate in the way panic usually does. There is no sudden break, no singular moment where fear announces itself. Instead, the soundscape narrows. Silence becomes structured. Presence becomes measurable. The recorder does not capture sound as we understand it. It captures displacement. I am authorizing controlled playback of the earliest files only. Later segments will remain sealed until review protocols are updated. If you are hearing this introduction, it means you have been cleared to proceed. Listen carefully. The recorder was never supposed to run without power. It did not need it. The earliest recordings do not announce what they will become. That is their most convincing quality. In the first several hours of audio, the recorder functions exactly as it was designed to. It is carried by a technician assigned to environmental documentation during the final operational week of the Morrow Ridge Research Annex. His role, as far as I can determine, was neither senior nor classified. He was there to record sound conditions during staged shutdowns, power reductions, and partial evacuations. Proof, essentially. Evidence for later disputes. The voice is steady, not theatrical. He speaks the way people do when they believe nothing important is happening. I hear him moving through corridors, pausing in rooms, making brief spoken notes about ambient conditions. He documents the building the way a mechanic documents an engine, listening for changes in pitch, rhythm, strain. The recorder is a tool. The building is a system. Neither is treated with reverence. At this stage, the annex is still alive. Ventilation systems hum unevenly. Lights buzz faintly. Somewhere beyond the range of the recorder, machinery cycles on and off. Doors open and close. Footsteps echo, sometimes close, sometimes distant enough to blur into the structure itself. Even silence, when it appears, is shallow. There is always something underneath it. What stands out, listening now, is how often the technician remarks on that fact. He notes that true quiet never exists in the building, that even unused rooms seem to breathe, that shutting down systems does not create silence so much as it rearranges the soundscape. These comments are casual, almost bored, the kind of observations people make when they have repeated the same task too many times and need to fill the air. Nothing in these early files would have justified archival preservation on its own. The Annex's power reduction begins midway through the first day of recording. Non-essential systems are taken offline in phases. Entire wings go dark. Elevators are restricted. HVAC output is reduced. The technician records before and after samples, as instructed. The differences are subtle but measurable. Fans drop in pitch. Electrical noise thins. Airflow becomes intermittent rather than constant. Still, the building speaks. The recorder captures it all faithfully. The technician mentions in passing that he prefers documenting during shutdowns. That it is easier to hear what matters when the noise floor drops. He is not speaking philosophically. He means loose panels, failing bearings, stress fractures, the language of decay. By the end of the second day, most of Sublevel 4 is inactive. According to the facility's own logs, this is when personnel presence drops to a skeleton crew. The technician remains behind longer than most, tasked with final documentation of areas scheduled to be sealed once structural inspections are complete. The recorder is with him constantly. There is no indication he ever turns it off. That detail becomes important later. At first, the recordings grow quieter in the expected way. Systems shut down, rooms empty. Human noise fades. Long stretches pass where only the faintest environmental sounds remain. The technician adapts, narrating more softly, as if matching the building's volume. Then something changes. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. There is no sudden intrusion, no foreign sound layered over the environment. What changes is the relationship between presence and sound. In earlier files, sound exists regardless of where the technician is standing. The building has its own baseline, but as the annex grows darker, the recorder begins to favor proximity. Ambient noise increases when the technician moves. It thins when he stops. In empty rooms, silence deepens to an unnatural degree, only to rebound the moment he shifts his weight or exhales too sharply. At first, this could be explained by acoustics. Smaller active zones, reduced airflow, sound traveling differently through unpowered space. The technician himself offers explanations like these, though only briefly. He is not alarmed. He simply adjusts his behavior, speaking more often to avoid recording what he describes as dead air. He jokes once about how the place sounds abandoned even when it is not. The joke does not land. By the third day, the annex experiences its first full blackout. The event is recorded in the facility's logs with minimal commentary. A cascade failure. A breaker that does not reset. Emergency systems engage, then fail one by one. Power is not restored. Personnel are instructed to evacuate remaining active areas. The technician is still below ground when it happens. His voice changes then, but not in the way panic usually announces itself. He does not shout, he does not curse. He lowers his volume, as if volume itself has become something that requires conservation. He remarks on the suddenness of the quiet, not the absence of light, not the loss of systems, the quiet. He describes it as thick, as if sound has weight now, and that weight is pressing down on everything else. He moves carefully, and when he does, the recorder responds immediately, filling with the sound of his own motion. When he stops, the recording collapses into a silence so complete it borders on pressure. This is the first point where the recorder's behavior begins to diverge from expectation in a way that cannot be dismissed. The blackout should have ended the recordings entirely. The device does not contain an internal battery. It does not draw residual charge. There is no plausible source of power remaining in Sublevel 4 at this point, and yet the recorder continues, uninterrupted, preserving audio with no degradation in quality or structure. The technician does not comment on this. There is no indication that he notices. His concern remains fixed on navigating the annex safely and completing his assignment. He speaks less now, but when he does, it is with an awareness that the silence around him is no longer neutral. He tests it once without realizing he is doing so. He stands in an empty lab, motionless, for nearly a full minute. The recorder captures almost nothing. Not static, not noise, not even the faint artifacts of digital compression. The waveform during this period flattens to a degree I have not observed elsewhere in the archive. It is not silence as a lack of sound, it is silence as an absolute. When he moves again, the audio returns instantly. Footsteps, breath, fabric shifting against skin. It is as if the recorder is waiting for him. The technician laughs nervously after that. He attributes it to nerves, to fatigue, to the building playing tricks in the dark. He resumes speaking, more frequently now, filling the space with his voice. I should note here that the facility logs indicate Sublevel 4 was officially abandoned less than an hour after the blackout. No personnel are listed as remaining below ground after that time. The recorder suggests otherwise. As the hours pass, the annex grows quieter than any occupied structure should ever be. The recorder captures fewer environmental sounds with each passing segment. The technician begins to comment on this directly. He remarks that even abandoned buildings usually have something: water, wind, distant traffic bleeding through concrete. Here there is nothing unless he creates it. He tests doors, he knocks on walls, he drags a chair across a floor simply to hear it scrape. Each sound blooms briefly in the recording, then collapses back into silence the moment it ends. There is a point late in the recordings from this phase where he stops trying to document and starts trying to reassure himself. He speaks continuously for several minutes, narrating his movements, his intentions, his observations. When he pauses to think, the silence presses in so quickly that he resumes talking mid-thought, as if afraid of what will happen if he lets the quiet complete itself. At no point in these early files does he suggest that the recorder itself is unusual. That realization comes later. For now, the device remains what it has always been to him, a witness. And witnesses, I have learned, are rarely as passive as we assume. If Part 1 documents a building losing its voice, then Part 2 records what happens when silence learns to listen. The technician remains underground far longer than the official logs admit. I cannot say whether this was intentional or the result of miscommunication during the evacuation, only that the recorder continues to place him within Sublevel 4, well past the time the annex was declared empty. The absence of other voices becomes one of the defining characteristics of this phase. No radio traffic, no distant footsteps, no shouted names echoing down corridors. Only him. In the hours following the blackout, his movements become cautious, not because of fear, but because sound itself has become unreliable. The recorder reveals a pattern that he seems to sense instinctively before he understands it intellectually. Noise exists only when it is generated. The moment he stops moving, stops breathing audibly, stops speaking, the environment collapses inward. At first, he tries to compensate. He hums while walking. He clears his throat unnecessarily. He taps the recorder casing with a fingernail at regular intervals, as if checking that it is still there. Each sound is captured clearly, blooming in the audio field, then vanishing the instant it ends. There is no decay, no reverberation. Sound does not linger here. It either exists fully or not at all. The annex is no longer a container for noise. It is a void punctured temporarily by activity. The technician begins to describe spaces less in terms of layout and more in terms of how they behave acoustically. Rooms are no longer large or small, open or closed. They are shallow or deep. Some swallow sound immediately. Others reflect it briefly, though never in the way he expects. Corridors that should echo do not. Rooms that should dampen noise sometimes return it too quickly, as if distance itself has been compressed. He remarks once that it feels like walking through a model of the building rather than the building itself. That comment passes without elaboration, but I have returned to it many times. As the hours pass, fatigue becomes audible. His speech slows, sentences trail off. He begins to repeat himself, narrating actions he has already described moments earlier. This repetition is not for the recorder's benefit. It is for his own. When he stops speaking entirely, the silence presses in with such immediacy that he resumes mid-thought, cutting himself off just to hear his own voice again. It is during this period that he begins to notice the recorder behaving strangely, though he does not articulate it as such at first. He comments on how sensitive it has become, how it seems to pick up even the smallest sounds with exaggerated clarity. His breathing, once a background element, now dominates the audio field whenever he grows anxious. Fabric movement sounds amplified. Swallowing is loud enough to startle him. He adjusts the gain settings. They do nothing. The recorder continues to capture sound at the same intensity, regardless of configuration. The technician mentions this with mild irritation, assuming a software fault. He taps the device again, harder this time. The impact is recorded crisply. When his hand stills, the silence returns instantly, as complete as before. There is no residual hum, no digital noise, no sign the recorder is struggling. It is functioning perfectly. He begins to move more deliberately after that, as if aware that motion itself has become a kind of switch. When he walks, the world exists. When he stops, it does not. He paces hallways not to get anywhere, but to maintain sound, to keep the space from collapsing into itself. At one point, he sits down. The recorder captures the sound of fabric against a metal chair, the faint scrape of legs on concrete. Then nothing. He remains seated for several minutes. I know this because the file continues uninterrupted. But during that time, there is no audio evidence that the world persists around him. No distant creak, no settling structure, no air movement, just absence. When he stands abruptly, the sound of motion floods back into the recording so suddenly that it is almost violent. He exhales sharply, startled not by something new, but by the return of what should have been there all along. He laughs afterward, thin and strained, and makes a comment about needing sleep. It is around this time that he attempts to leave Sublevel 4. The recorder documents his approach to the service elevator. The button press is audible. There is no response. He presses it again, harder. The sound of plastic clicking is sharp in the void. Nothing answers. He waits, shifting his weight from foot to foot, producing just enough sound to keep the silence from closing fully. When it becomes clear the elevator will not come, he does not panic. Instead, he narrates alternatives aloud, mapping routes in his head and speaking them into the recorder as if anchoring them in sound will make them real. He chooses a stairwell. The stairwell is different. Unlike the corridors and labs, it does not collapse into silence as completely when he stops. There is a faint, persistent presence here, something like pressure equalizing or distant movement too slow to resolve into sound. He remarks on it with relief, calling it background, and lingers longer than necessary on the landing, breathing deeply. The recorder captures this background consistently, but I note that it does not resemble any mechanical or environmental noise I can identify. It is not wind, not water, not structural settling. It exists at the edge of audibility, constant but undefined. When he resumes climbing, the sound fades behind him. He does not reach the surface. The stairwell is blocked several levels up, collapsed or sealed. He records the obstruction in detail, tapping on debris, knocking experimentally, calling out once despite knowing no one will answer. His voice echoes briefly here, distorted in a way that suggests the space beyond the blockage does not behave normally. He does not comment on that. Instead, he returns downward, slower this time, conserving sound. His breathing grows measured, controlled. He has learned that noise is a resource now. The longer he remains underground, the more intentional his behavior becomes. He plans movements to minimize time spent in complete stillness. He begins speaking even when alone in rooms, narrating thoughts that do not require narration. He speculates aloud about how long rescue might take, about whether power will be restored, about whether the recorder will help document what happened if something goes wrong. There is an irony there that he does not recognize. At some point, he notices that the recorder never captures his footsteps when he is not looking at it. This realization is subtle. He does not announce it directly. Instead, he performs a series of unconscious tests. He walks while holding the recorder out in front of him. Footsteps are clear. He tucks it against his side. They soften. He sets it down on a table and steps away. The sound of his movement diminishes rapidly, thinning as distance increases until only the faintest suggestion remains. When he returns to the device, the sound blooms again. He attributes this to microphone orientation, to directional sensitivity. He rotates the recorder, taps it from different angles, experiments briefly. The results do not change. Sound is strongest when he is near it. Sound weakens when he is not. This should have frightened him. Instead, it makes him thoughtful. He begins carrying the recorder differently, keeping it closer to his chest. He speaks more softly now, as if loud sound might provoke something. His words become deliberate, chosen. He avoids long pauses. When he does fall silent, it is only for seconds at a time. There is a stretch of recording here that is almost entirely composed of breathing. Slow, controlled, intentional. The silence presses at the edges, never quite completing itself because he does not allow it to. In one of the few direct excerpts I will include here, he says quietly, "I don't think it likes it when I stop." He does not explain what "it" refers to. After that, his behavior changes again. He stops testing the silence and starts avoiding it. He keeps moving even when there is nowhere to go. He walks in circles around familiar rooms, tracing paths between equipment racks and empty desks. He knocks on walls as he passes them, not to test their integrity, but to hear the sound return. He drags objects behind him occasionally, creating a continuous noise that fills the space. The recorder captures all of this faithfully. It does not capture anything else. There are no other sounds in the annex now. No distant impacts, no settling. No evidence that the structure exists beyond the immediate radius of his activity. The world has shrunk to the distance his sound can reach. Time becomes difficult to track during this phase. The technician loses awareness of hours passing. He speaks of hunger, of thirst, of exhaustion, but without urgency. His primary concern is maintaining presence, staying audible. At some point, he acknowledges the recorder's continued operation explicitly. He remarks that it should be dead by now, that it has no power, that he does not remember replacing batteries because there are no batteries to replace. He says this casually, almost dismissively, as if stating it aloud will make it less important. He does not stop recording. He cannot. The recorder never fails. It never degrades. Its audio quality remains pristine, even as the world it documents becomes increasingly abstract. It behaves as though power is not something it consumes, but something it ignores. The technician begins to refer to it less as equipment and more as a companion. He apologizes to it once, after accidentally knocking it to the floor. The sound of impact is loud enough to make him flinch. When he picks it up, he exhales in relief, commenting on how quiet it would be without it. That comment lingers. By the end of this phase, the annex has become a place defined entirely by interaction. Nothing exists unless it is touched, moved, spoken into being. Silence is no longer neutral. It is something that advances when unopposed. The technician understands this now, even if he does not articulate it fully. His movements are constant. His voice, though tired, rarely stops. The recorder remains close to him at all times, and it is still recording. There is a point in the recordings where movement stops being a strategy and becomes a ritual. By the time the final phase begins, the technician no longer wanders the annex. He has chosen a space and remains within it, circling, pacing, repeating the same routes until the paths are worn into habit. The recorder documents this through repetition rather than description. The same footfalls, the same pauses, the same soft exhalation at the same corner. Every circuit. He has found a way to live inside sound. The room he settles in was once a monitoring station, windowless, lined with consoles that are now dark and inert. There is a single table, a chair, and a low ceiling that compresses the acoustics into something manageable. When he speaks here, the recorder captures his voice with a closeness that borders on intimacy. The silence outside the room does not intrude as aggressively. He remarks on this with relief, calling it contained, as if he has finally found a place where absence has boundaries. He arranges objects deliberately, metal tools on the table, a loose cable dragged across the floor, anything that can be moved to generate sound without requiring constant effort. He sets these things in motion, then listens as they decay into stillness, judging how quickly the silence presses back in. The recorder captures each experiment faithfully. What it does not capture, increasingly, is the annex beyond the room. Earlier recordings contained faint hints of space, even in silence. A sense that walls extended outward, that rooms existed beyond the immediate area of sound. That impression fades now. The absence grows uniform, featureless. When the technician stops moving, it is as if the world ends at the edge of his breath. He begins to talk about this explicitly, not in the language of fear, but in the language of someone trying to understand a system. He speculates that sound is not being absorbed, but replaced. That when noise ceases, something else fills the space immediately, something that does not register as sound but still occupies it. He struggles to articulate this, circling the idea without landing on it, frustrated by the limits of language. At one point, he says, very quietly, that silence feels crowded. After that, he becomes careful about when he allows himself to stop. Sleep becomes a problem. The recorder captures several attempts. He sits in the chair, breathing slowly, speaking aloud to keep the space active. His voice slurs as exhaustion sets in. He counts backward. He recites procedural checklists he remembers from training, not because they matter, but because they are familiar rhythms. Each time his voice falters, the silence surges forward instantly, so complete and oppressive that he jolts awake mid-breath, gasping loudly enough to reassert the world. The recorder never misses these moments. It records the sharp intake of air, the sudden rustle of movement, the whispered curses that follow. It records the relief in his voice when sound returns, when the room feels real again. There is no audio evidence that he ever fully loses consciousness. As time stretches on, his understanding of the recorder changes. He stops adjusting it, stops testing it, stops questioning its operation. He accepts that it will continue regardless of circumstance. Instead, he begins to watch how it behaves in relation to him, how sound blooms when he is close, how it thins when he steps away, how the silence sharpens when the device is set down and left alone. This observation leads him to a conclusion that he approaches reluctantly. The recorder is not capturing sound, it is capturing displacement. He does not use that word, but the idea is there. He describes sound as something that pushes back against the silence, carving out a space where the world can exist. When sound stops, that space collapses. The recorder does not record the collapse itself, only the edges of it, the moments where presence gives way. He tests this theory carefully. He places the recorder on the table and steps back, moving slowly, narrating as he goes. His footsteps grow faint, then vanish entirely, even though he is still moving. He speaks and his voice remains present, but thinner now, as if stretched across distance that should not exist. When he stops speaking, the silence completes itself. The recorder captures nothing for several seconds. Then he speaks again, urgently, and the world snaps back into being around the device. He laughs after this, a brittle sound that does not reach his eyes. He says something about experiments always going wrong when you stop observing them. He does not leave the recorder unattended after that. There is a moment late in the recordings where his voice drops almost to a whisper. I think it's measuring how much of me is here. He says. He does not elaborate. From this point forward, his behavior becomes increasingly constrained. He limits his movements to a small radius around the recorder. He keeps one hand on it almost constantly, as if physical contact will anchor him. The recorder captures the sound of skin against plastic, over and over, a soft, rhythmic reassurance. He speaks less about escape now, less about rescue. Those topics fall away, replaced by practical concerns about endurance, about how long he can continue generating sound, about what will happen when he cannot. The annex, as a space, no longer matters. It has receded entirely. There is only the room, the recorder, and the silence pressing at the edges. It is during this phase that the recordings grow longest. Hours pass with little variation. The technician paces. He speaks occasionally. He taps objects to keep sound alive. The recorder continues to function without interruption, without degradation, without any sign of power draw or failure. From an archival perspective, this constancy is unnerving. From a human perspective, it is devastating. Eventually, his voice begins to change in a way that has nothing to do with fear. It weakens, not suddenly, not dramatically. It simply loses strength, syllable by syllable, as exhaustion and dehydration take their toll. He becomes more economical with words, choosing short phrases over full sentences. He breathes more often between sounds, as if even air has become difficult to move. The silence responds eagerly to these gaps. It surges forward the instant his voice falters, forcing him to fight it back with movement, with noise, with anything he has left. The recorder captures the strain in these efforts, the tremor in his hands, the uneven rhythm of his steps. At one point, he drops the recorder. The impact is loud, startling, and for a brief moment the world feels solid again. He scrambles to pick it up, apologizing under his breath, clutching it to his chest as if it were alive. "I can't keep it up," he admits quietly, more to himself than to the device. There is a long pause after that. Not silence. He does not allow that yet, but a pause in movement, a stillness that feels deliberate. When he speaks again, his voice is calm in a way it has not been for some time. He says he wants to understand what happens when sound truly ends. He frames it as a final test, an experiment worth completing. He assures himself that the recorder will document it, that whatever is happening here will not go unobserved. He sits down. The recorder captures the sound of fabric settling, the soft creak of the chair. His breathing continues, shallow and measured. He speaks quietly, describing what he feels as the silence presses closer, how it feels less like emptiness now and more like pressure equalizing. Then he stops speaking. The recorder continues. For several seconds, there is almost nothing. Not the absolute absence captured earlier, but something close enough that the distinction feels academic. The waveform flattens. The space feels compressed, as if the room itself is folding inward. There is a sound then, not a voice, not movement. A subtle shift, like air being displaced without motion. The recorder captures it cleanly. After that, there is no further evidence of the technician's presence. No breath, no movement, no voice returning to reclaim the space. The silence does not surge or retreat. It stabilizes. The recorder continues to record. Hours pass. Days. The device remains active, capturing a silence that no longer reacts to proximity, no longer blooms or collapses. The world it measures has settled into a new equilibrium. There is no indication of life, only duration. When the recovery team eventually retrieves the recorder, it responds to their presence immediately. Footsteps appear in the audio, voices bloom into existence. The silence retreats as if it had been waiting. The recorder never stops. I completed my review of this file in a controlled environment, with playback limited to short intervals and mandatory recovery periods between sessions. This was not protocol when the recorder was first catalogued. It became protocol afterward. The device itself remains unchanged. No internal battery has ever been discovered, no hidden capacitor, no anomalous material composition. Its circuitry matches commercially available designs from the period down to the component level. There is no modification that would explain its continued operation, let alone the consistency of its performance across years of uninterrupted runtime. We disassembled it once. That was a mistake. When the casing was opened, the recorder continued to record. The microphones were disconnected. The internal clock was removed. The memory module was isolated. Still, new data was written. Still, the internal timestamp advanced. The act of disassembly produced sound, and the device captured it, despite having no physical means to do so. I ordered it reassembled immediately. Playback analysis confirms what the technician intuited without fully understanding. The recorder does not document sound as vibration moving through air. It documents presence as interruption. When something occupies space, when it displaces what would otherwise be nothing, the recorder registers it. Silence in this context is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of interference. The technician believed that sound pushed back the silence, that noise carved out a space where the world could exist. That belief was close enough to the truth to keep him alive longer than he should have been. But it was incomplete. The recorder does not require sound. It requires something to interrupt absence. Breath, movement, pressure, heat. The smallest assertion of existence is enough to register. When those assertions stop, the recorder does not fail. It simply has nothing left to measure. What remains after that is not silence as we understand it. It is equilibrium. I have cross-referenced this artifact against 7 other Vault 13 files involving anomalous recording devices. In all previous cases, the devices captured something extra. Sounds that should not exist, voices without speakers, environments that contradicted physical reality. This recorder captured less. That distinction matters. There is no evidence that whatever displaced the technician replaced him in any conventional sense. No new sounds appear, no movement. No signals that would suggest occupation by another entity. The absence does not behave like a presence with intent. It behaves like a state. The technician was not taken. He was completed. This interpretation is supported by the final recordings. After his disappearance, the silence stabilizes. It no longer reacts. No longer advances or retreats. The recorder continues to function, but there is nothing left for it to respond to until new presence is introduced. When the recovery team enters the chamber, sound returns instantly. Footsteps, voices, equipment noise. The silence yields without resistance, not because it is defeated, but because it is displaced again. The recorder does not prefer one state over the other. It records both. I have listened to the final hours of silence more than once. That, too, was a mistake. There is nothing audible in those segments, nothing a listener would consciously identify as dangerous. And yet, extended exposure produces measurable effects. After prolonged playback, I experience a sensation best described as thinning, as if my own presence is less firmly anchored in the room. Objects feel more distant. My breathing sounds intrusive. I find myself moving deliberately, speaking aloud when there is no reason to do so, just to reassure myself that the space remains occupied. These effects pass when playback stops. Mostly. For this reason, access to the final segments has been restricted. Not because they contain something overtly harmful, but because they encourage a behavior that is difficult to recognize until it has already begun. The urge to fill space, the discomfort with stillness, the suspicion that silence is no longer passive. I have archived the recorder in a sealed containment locker with continuous environmental monitoring. It does not register on those systems unless someone is physically present. When the archive room is empty, sensors detect nothing unusual. When I enter, the recorder resumes logging immediately. It does not need to be activated. It only needs to be near something that exists. There is one final detail I have not yet logged, and I do so now only because omission would be a greater error. While compiling this closing entry, I paused my narration twice. Both times I remained seated at my desk, motionless, allowing the room to settle around me. During the second pause, I became aware of a pressure behind my ears, subtle but distinct, as if the air itself were adjusting. I spoke again before the sensation could develop further. The archive room responded as expected. Sound returned. Presence reasserted itself. Nothing else occurred. I am confident that the recorder remains contained. I am less confident that containment is the correct term. This file will remain sealed, pending further review. Playback is authorized only in short intervals, with mandatory movement and verbalization during exposure. Extended silence in the presence of this artifact is strongly discouraged. The recorder was never supposed to run without power. It does not require it. What it requires is something willing to take up space. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.